Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is that we're going to log into the admin console. And the admin console for Keycloak allows you to configure all sorts of aspects about your clients and your users and your realm itself. Where Realms allows you to provide a way of encapsulating users and clients into a nice sandboxed area so that you can have different realms for different purposes. We're going to create a new realm for the demo today. I'm going to call it demo, and I'm also going to give it a little nice friendly name as well for when users themselves see the realm. As part of today's demo, I'm going to be using various different flows that requires Keycloak to be able to send email. So I need to configure an SMTP server in Keycloak. I'm using Google's SMTP server here, which allows me to send a few emails each day, which is nice for demo purposes, but obviously not sufficient for a production use case. Right, so now that I have that configured, I can test that Keycloak is able to send an email. So let's go to my inbox and make sure that we got this test message from Keycloak. And here you go, there's a test message from Keycloak, so we know that email sending from Keycloak is working as expected. I have an example application that I'm going to be using throughout the demo today, and I need to configure this in Keycloak, and this is in order for this application to be allowed to authenticate via Keycloak. So that's all I need to do to configure this client inside Keycloak. Now let's go and have a look at this sample application. When I'm opening the example application, I'm immediately redirected to Keycloak to authenticate. I can't actually log in at this point because obviously there is no users in my realm at this point. So what we could do, we could have gone and we could have added a new user as an admin. But in this case, what we actually want to do is we want to let users self-register to this application. So we can do this by basically just enabling the user registration option in the admin console for this realm, and we can save this. But we also want to make sure that these users verify their email so that we know that their email is a valid email. Okay, so now if I refresh the login page, I've now got the option to register a user. Okay, so I'm going to fill in all the details to register a new user. And then Keycloak will prompt me to verify my email address since I required that for my realm. So let's go to my email. And this sends me a special link, and the link goes to Keycloak. And when Keycloak sees this link, there's a special token in there that Keycloak knows that this particular user has now verified their email address. And it also will redirect automatically to the application and have the user authenticated. So we can see here now that the application is able to know who I am. So it has my name, and it has this because it has a special ID token, and the ID token contains various different claims about my user. It is also signed by Keycloak so that the application can trust the details inside this token. The application also has what's called an access token, and that's another type of token that the application can use when it wants to invoke any REST APIs, so allowing the REST APIs to then know who the user is and what kind of permission this user has. So at the moment what the application knows about me is pretty much my email address and my first name and last name. I also want to add a little bit extra to this token so that the user can know some more details about me. So I can go to my users in Keycloak, I can find the user, and I can add an additional attribute about this user. What I'm going to add is I'm going to add an avatar URL so that the application is able to show a nice avatar for the logged in user. I could also have extended the registration screen to add this to the registration screen, or I could add it to the Keycloak account management console to let users then fill this detail into the in their profile through the account management console. But let's just add it here for now because we have a bit limited time today. So now at this point, Keycloak is aware about this avatar URL, but the client is still not able to see this because we haven't mapped this particular attribute into the token yet. We're going to do that by creating a client scope. Client scopes allow you to create elements that you can add to your token, which can then be shared between multiple clients. So I'm going to create a scope. I'm just going to call it my scope, and I'm going to give it a little nice friendly username or a little friendly name as well. So now I have an empty scope. It doesn't do anything other than add a particular scope to the token. But I also wanted to do something else. I want to add the avatar to all clients that have this scope. So I'm going to create a mapper, so a protocol mapper, which allows me to map things into the token. I'm going to choose a user attribute mapper, and that allows me to map the user attribute avatar URL into the token, and I can choose what claim name I want to put it into. I'm going to put it into as avatar URL as well. And then finally I'll just give this mapper a name so that we can refer to it later. If you're looking at here, we can choose what tokens does this information be added to. We can choose to add it only to the ID token or also to the access token. In this case, we only want the front-end application, so the application that uses the ID token to see this. So once we've saved that, now we can go back to our client and we can configure what client scopes are available for this particular client. And it's a good idea to limit the client scopes that are in a token for several reasons. So one is that if you have too many client scopes in a token, then the tokens may become very large, and also then you have tokens that contains more permissions and more claims than the application should be able to see. So you want to limit this down to basically to harden and to reduce any impact of a compromised client. So we're going to add this my scope as a default client scope. That means that it's always added to the token. We could have added an optional client scope, which means that it's not by default added to the token, but the client has to explicitly request this scope for it to be added. So if we now go back to our application, we don't have to re-log in to get these additional claims now on the token. We can just refresh our token and we will now be able to see these additional claims. So we can now see that we have this avatar URL. So if we go to the front page of the application, we now can see that the application can take that avatar URL out of the token and now display a nice little avatar for the logged in user. Another thing we can easily do is that we can require consent, and that means that the application won't be automatically granted access to all of these claims and all of these scopes, but rather it will be prompted that the user has to approve the application to have this access. So if I now log in again, this time around I'm not just automatically forwarded onto the application, but rather I'm now prompted to grant access to various different privileges to this application, and I'll go ahead and give that. And again, now the application has all of these details. So let's turn that off again, so we don't have to grant access again for different users and different clients throughout the demo. What we're going to now look at, roles. So Keycloak has support for simple roles, and we also have support for what we call composite roles, where a composite role can be a composite of other roles. A composite role can be useful, for instance, if you want to have a default role that's added to all self-registered users and then still allow you to add and remove roles to this composite role to automatically have it added to all users. I'm going to create just a simple role this time around. I'm going to create a user role, and then at the moment there's no users in this actual role, so let's go and find our user and let's map this role onto the user. And now we want to go back to our client and we're going to have a look at what scope this client is allowed to have. So you can see at the moment it has this full scope allowed, which basically means that this client will have access to all the roles that the user has. We don't want that. We want to limit it down to specific roles. So we only want this particular client to be able to access that user role. If we now go back to Keycloak, we refresh our tokens. You can look at the ID token. There's no knowledge about roles in here, and that's because by default we assume that only the services themselves needs to be able to grant permission to access, and that the front-end application is just invoking these back-end services that then will check the permissions. If we look at the access token, we can now see that there is this role user in the actual access token. So any service that requires that user role, we can now invoke with this token. Keycloak also has support for groups, and groups is slightly different to roles. So groups allows you to add attributes onto users, part of that group, and it also allows you to map roles onto users in this group. Or you can also use the groups directly if your applications have a concept of groups. So we're going to create a new group. We're just going to call it my group, and at the moment that's just an empty group. We can choose to map that group name into the token as well, or we can, as I said before, we can say that all users that are part of this group will get this user role, and we can also say that any users part of this group will have this specific user attribute added to them. So we're going to just add this user type consumers attribute. And now we want to go to our user and we want to make him part of this group. And at the moment, Keycloak is aware that the user is part of this group, but we also need to be able to map this information into the token. So we need to go to the client scopes again, and instead of creating a new client scope, we're just going to extend on the my scope that we created before. We could have created a new, say, my group or whatever we wanted scope as well. But we're just going to extend on this one. So we're going to add another program mapper. This time we're going to add a group membership. This lets us map the group memberships of the user into the token. And again, I can choose to add it to the ID token, the access token, and the user info input. And I can choose exactly where it's added. We'll just select all of it for now. So now we have in the token. So if I refresh my token now, I can see now that I have groups. So I have this my group group in the token as well. But we still don't have that attribute. So let's create another mapper for that. We're going to add, of course, a user attribute mapper, and we're just going to call it type, and we're going to pull in that user type attribute, and again we'll just pull it into everything, and then we're going to now go back to the application. We're going to refresh the token. And now we can see if we can find it. There you go. So there's the claim user type consumers. Okay, so now we have a user created through Keycloak, and we have a couple of attributes, and we've extended the tokens and so on. Let's now look at how we can get users in from an external store. So we're going to pull in some users from an ldap server that I have running here locally. First of all, I'm going to choose to use the writable edit mode, which allows you to change the user through the Keycloak admin console or the account management console and have them written back to Keycloak. No, sorry, back to the ldap server. We could have also chose read only, which means that Keycloak is not able to make any changes to this user, or we can keep them unsynced, which means that Keycloak will maintain the changes but won't write them back to ldap. I'm going to use the other as a vendor because that basically pre-fills a lot of the settings that I need for this particular ldap server. And then I'm going to pass in the connection URL. I'm going to check that that works, and that's working fine. And I need to tell Keycloak where in the directory to actually find users. I also need to tell Keycloak how to authenticate with this ldap server. I'm going to test that the authentication works, and that worked fine. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this. Now that I've saved this new user federation provider in the realm, Keycloak is now able to read users from the ldap server. I can choose how users are loaded. I can either have them loaded on demand as Keycloak as users are authenticating. So Keycloak will then look for a user by this username in the ldap server and will pull it in on demand. Or I can choose to synchronize it all in one go. I can also choose to synchronize only the change users, which will use the changelog features available in ldap servers to only synchronize what changes have occurred since the last time I did a synchronization. I can now look at my users in my realm. I can see that we have the user that self-registered before, but we now have these two new users, and these have been pulled in from ldap. If we take a look at this user for here, we can see that this is actually linked to that ldap provider that we created before. Okay, so now that we have users from ldap, let's also have a look at the identity brokering feature. As I said before, so we allow you to authenticate users with an external SAML2 or OpenID Connect provider, as well as a number of different social networks. In this case, I'm going to choose GitHub. And the reason why I'm choosing GitHub is that GitHub is very easy to create the necessary configuration on the Keycloak side. No, sorry, on the GitHub side. And I wanted to show you the whole flow that's required to set this up. So I have to give it a name, I have to give it a homepage URL, which is basically telling GitHub users where does this application exist. And I also need a special redirect URI. So the redirect URI is where Keycloak expects to be redirected back after the authentication has happened on GitHub. And this is locking down exactly where this is permitted for this particular client. So once I've registered that in GitHub, I get a client ID and a client secret that allows Keycloak to authenticate with GitHub, so that GitHub knows that it's actually Keycloak that is trying to initiate this external authentication. So once I've saved this, I'm now able, if I now go to my JavaScript console and I log out, I now get this option of logging in via GitHub. We're not going to do that just yet because we want to do one more thing. We actually want to pull in this avatar from GitHub into the internal user in Keycloak so that we can get it available for the client. We'll do this by creating a mapper, which is allowed makes it able to map an attribute from GitHub into our internal user. I'm going to call it avatar URL. I'm going to pull in the avatar underscore URL from GitHub, and I'm going to pull it into the same user attribute name in Keycloak. So now that I've done that, there's one last piece that we actually want to do. Since we are requiring users to verify their email in our realm, and GitHub has already verified emails for their users, we're going to actually trust emails to be verified by GitHub, so we're not going to require them to re-verify their emails. So if I now log in with GitHub, I'm now asked to authorize access to Keycloak. I'm going to do that. And here you go. So now the application, so now I've been able to log in via GitHub, and the application also has been able to load my avatar directly from GitHub as well as my name. Okay, so looking a little bit at this login screen, of course it's styled to match the Keycloak styling. You may want to change this to match your corporate branding or your application branding. And this is pretty easy in Keycloak. So all you need to do is create a custom login theme, which you then can deploy onto the Keycloak server. The theme can consist of style sheets or images, and it can also override the actual HTML templates that's behind the actual screens. I've already created one and I've deployed it onto the Keycloak server. So I'm going to change to this new theme. And we can see here that now that I've changed the theme, the login screen looks completely differently. So since this is a little bit distracting with this whole rainbow effect, I'm going to change it back to the Keycloak theme for the rest of the demo. Okay, so let's go ahead and log into the application again, as I want to show some features about the actual tokens in Keycloak. So we have the JSON based format for the claims in the token, but here we have the actual base64 encoded, or the encoded version of the token. This contains basically of three different parts. So you have the first part, which is headers, which identifies what signing algorithms and keys and other things about the token, and then you have the actual payload or your claims, and finally you have the signature part of the token. So I've deployed a little extension to Keycloak which allows me to actually verify or decode these tokens. So all I need to do is paste in this encoded version of the token and then submit that. And now I can see that the token is valid, and I can also check that it's been signed with the active key. I can also see the various different bits of the tokens. I can see the header and I can see the payload. What we're interested in now is we want to look at this algorithm here. That's the algorithm that's used to create the signature for the token. And we can see that it's using RS-256. So RS-256 is RSA based signatures. what we want to do is we want to actually change this to ecliptic type signatures. We could have gone into the realm and we can change the default signature for the whole realm to ES256, which is an ecliptic based signature. But that's maybe a little bit problematic, since we may have other clients that are not able to verify signatures of this type, while RS256 is a lot more widespread available these days. So we're going to leave the realm defaults, and instead we're going to go into this particular client, and we're going to choose to use ES256 for any tokens issued to this client. I can now go back to my application. I don't have to re-log in to get new tokens. I can just refresh my tokens. And now I will have a new ID token. I can paste that into my verifier. And we can see that now the token is now signed with a different algorithm. Similarly to how we can change signatures, we can also change the keys used to sign the tokens. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a new set of keys for the ES256 signatures. I'm going to set a high priority so that this now becomes my new active signing keys. I can also go and I can make sure that the old signing keys are no longer active, which means that they won't be used to sign any tokens. They will only be used to verify tokens. So if I now refresh my tokens, again, I can do that still, even though I have tokens. My refresh token is using the old signature keys, and now I will get new tokens that are signed with the new keys. So if I go back to my application, I can see that currently, or the previous token was signed with these keys here. And if I now submit this new token, I can see that the actual keys being used have changed. And I can also go to the admin console and I can look and I can see that that is indeed the actual active keys. Okay, so the next thing I want to show is session management. Keycloak, basically all tokens issued by Keycloak are associated with an SSO session. We have support for both online sessions, which means that it's tracking the user that's logged in through the browser, as well as an offline such session, which enables a session in your application even though the user is now logged out. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the actual user that's logged in, and we're going to look at that user's sessions. I believe it's this user here, and we can see here that we have a session open. I'm going to go ahead and actually log out this session, and I'm going to now try to refresh my tokens, and you can see that the token is no longer valid, or the session is no longer valid, so I have to then re-log in. Similarly, if I try to now verify the token, I can see that the session is no longer active. Okay, so let's take a look at events in Keycloak. We can see here that Keycloak is saving a number of events in the system that allows you to see what's happening in your system. So we can see here, if we go back into the history, we can see that we updated the realm. And we can see that we created a client, we created some execution flows, and we created a realm, and so on. And we can also see all the login events. Not only can you have these events saved into Keycloak and then be able to see them through the admin console, but you're also able to create your own custom event listeners that can listen to all these events and handle them exactly how you want them to be handled. Looking a little bit about how extensible Keycloak is, Keycloak provides a whole number of different SPIs where you can create your own custom code and deploy to Keycloak. So you can create your own custom protocol mappers, you can create your own custom user stores, and you can also create your own custom authenticators. So what we're going to do here, since I already created a custom authenticator and I've deployed it on the Keycloak, we're going to configure that into our realm. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a copy of the current flow used for browser-based logins. And then we're going to get rid of the username password form, because that is what we're going to replace with this custom authenticator that we created. So we're going to add this thing called a magic link, and then we're going to make it into the required step in this flow. We also need to go and change what actual flows are being used by Keycloak for browser-based logins. So if I now go back to my application and try to log in, I can see that no longer I'm being asked for a username and password, but just my email address. So I'm going to provide that, and now it tells me to check my inbox. So I'm going to check my inbox, and in my inbox there's a special link that basically proves that I am who I am, say I am, and that's going to open up on Keycloak. Keycloak is then going to verify me as the user, and it's going to then redirect me to the application, and I'm going to be authenticated, all without having to provide a password. So other things that we can do is, for instance, if we want to go to the flow and we want to say that actually we want OTP logins to be required. If we now go back to our application and log in again, then when we do that, we'll be logged in from that custom authenticator, but that other built-in authenticator will now require us to set up OTP. And since the reason why it's asking us to set up OTP is because we now require OTPs in the realm, but the user doesn't have one set up already, so we're now asking the user to set one up. So the user will then set it up, and the next time around he will be asked for a one-time code. And we can, of course, change this to not longer be required, and we can make any changes like this if we want to.